In early December 1941, the men of Patrol Wing 10 in the Philippines were sending back reports that directly contradicted the official line from Washington. Their PBY Catalinas were finding dozens of Japanese ships and hundreds of bombers massing for an assault on Luzon. The war was not coming in April. It was coming now. At the seaplane base in Olongapo, 20-year-old Charles Beckner listened as his squadron commander ordered every man to write out their will. Charles sat with a pencil and paper, thinking about his sister Mary and his brother James back in Indiana. He did not own much, but he wrote down his wishes on a clean sheet, dated it December 7th, 1941, and sealed it in an envelope. The envelope would never leave the island. Across the Philippines, the tension was thick enough to cut. The PBY patrols kept finding more ships. One pilot counted 20 Japanese merchant vessels in Cam Ranh Bay. Another patrol spotted 50 ships, including destroyers and cruisers, steaming off the Indochina coast. The Japanese were not holding maneuvers, they were positioning for the kill. In the early hours of December 8th, a decoded message from Admiral Hart reached Cavite and was relayed to Olongapo. It read simply, "Japan started hostilities. Govern yourselves accordingly." Commander Neal read the message 3 times, then gave the order to rouse the squadron. Lamps blazed in the barracks as men stumbled into the darkness, pulling on clothes and grabbing their gear. Charles helped the ground crews load 500-pound bombs onto the wings of the PBYs. As he lifted a box of 50 caliber ammunition, he noticed the label. "These are practice rounds," he said. The sailor pushing the box shrugged and pushed it back. "This is all we have," he said. The noise of the guns would have to do the job the bullets could not. While the planes taxied out for launch, a radio man relayed a new message. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. A pilot called it nonsense, but the message was real. Later that morning, Charles learned that an ensign had been killed in Davao Gulf when Japanese planes strafed his PBY. The war had arrived on every front at once. On December 10th, a PBY returning from patrol was shot up by friendly fire. A nervous Filipino anti-aircraft battery had opened up on the plane as it made its approach to Subic Bay. The pilot brought the aircraft in for a hard landing. Charles grabbed his medical pack and climbed through the waste hatch into a compartment awash with leaking fuel, seawater, and fresh blood. A machinist's mate lay on a cot with his leg nearly severed at the knee. Charles tightened a tourniquet above the wound and gave him morphine, but the blood loss was too severe. He died a few hours later in the Marine Field Hospital. A radio man had taken a round in the groin but would recover. The co-pilot, flying with a patched elbow from a previous injury, was bandaged and sent back to duty. It was the squadron's first combat death, and it had come from their own side. The men of Olongapo dug foxholes and sandbagged their positions. They had no air cover, no effective ammunition, and no clear idea where the Japanese would strike next. The chaos of a war that had begun without warning was settling into a grim, defensive routine. The morning of December 11th began with the smell of coffee and the sight of men boiling their white uniforms in vats to dye them a muddy khaki. An hour after sunrise, a lone Zero flashed over the bay, testing the defenses. Minutes later, a full formation of fighters swept in from Fort Wint. Charles scrambled to the superstructure of the decommissioned USS Rochester and drew his service pistol. He fired at the incoming planes in pure frustration. The Zeros came in low, ripping the water with machine gun and cannon fire. One after another, the 7 PBYs moored in the bay burst into flames. A Marine on the water tower traded shots with a Zero using his Browning automatic rifle, running around the catwalk to avoid the strafing runs while the tank bled out from dozens of bullet holes. The attack lasted less than 20 minutes. Every plane was sunk or burning. The survivors gathered at the hangar in silence. 2 men were dead, the co-pilot and the chief machinist's mate. The fresh water dribbled from the punctured water tower. The wing commander flew in to survey the damage and made the decision to evacuate all remaining flyable personnel to Los Baños. Charles was one of 8 men left behind as a skeleton crew, watching the trucks rumble out of the base in the fading light. The trap had closed. On the morning of December 13th, Charles Beckner turned 21. There was no cake, no celebration. He walked into Barrio Olongapo and a Filipino family pressed a warm loaf of bread into his hands. He ate the whole thing sitting under a palm tree, watching the punctured water tower still dribble its last fresh water onto the sand. Japanese bombers flew over unchallenged that afternoon. The Marines had already begun preparing the fuel stores for demolition. Beckner knew it was only a matter of time before the base was abandoned. 4 days later, a truck from Cavite arrived. Lieutenant Tom Pollock told the 8 men left behind to load whatever spares they could carry. They were pulling out. Olongapo was finished. On December 19th, Beckner stood on the tarmac at Sangley Point and watched 9 Japanese bombers separate into 3 perfect V formations. They were too high for the anti-aircraft guns. The whistling of falling bombs was the only warning. When the first wave hit, the ground bounced. Charles ran for a slit trench but stopped to drag a blinded sailor out of the open. For an hour, waves of bombers and strafing fighters tore the base apart. When the smoke cleared, Beckner worked beside a medical officer on the cracked tarmac, packing wounds and tying off arteries. The Navy yard across the bay was a column of black smoke. The Asiatic fleet had already sailed south. There was no help coming. On the night of December 24th, Beckner rode in the back of a truck with the last men leaving Cavite. The convoy threaded through Manila under a pall of smoke. The streets were choked with refugees, carabao carts, and soldiers heading the same direction. At midnight, the demolition charges went off. 2,000 tons of smokeless powder erupted in a rising sun that lit up the whole bay. Beckner watched the fireballs climb from his truck bed. By the following morning, the convoy reached Marivilles at the southern tip of Bataan. He climbed down stiff and salt-crusted, a man without a unit, without a plane, standing on the last piece of ground the Navy still held. On December 26th, Beckner arrived at Marivilles, with nothing but his medical bag and the uniform on his back. The base was crowded with sailors and Marines who had retreated from Cavite and Manila, men without ships or clear orders. He found the remnants of Patrol Wing 10 bivouacked in the trees under the command of Lieutenant Commander Frank Bridget. The squadron had been reorganized into a naval battalion for beach defense. Beckner asked about the Navy nurses from Canyacao. Someone told him they had been moved to Army hospitals in Manila just before the Japanese closed the roads. No one could tell him where Tilly Finian was. The reorganization assigned Beckner to a reserve pool of corpsmen attached to the Beach Defense Battalion. He had no regular watch and no fixed station. His duty was to stand by near the medical office in the Navy tunnel and wait for assignments or emergencies. It was a holding pattern, and he felt the weight of it. He was a man who needed to move forward, to act, to find purpose in the collapse. On December 27th, Beckner crossed the North Channel to Corregidor on a barge packed with Marines. The island had been bombed repeatedly, its surface churned to rubble. He walked into the Malinta Tunnel complex and felt the mountain press against his lungs. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, antiseptic, and diesel. The tunnel stretched into darkness with side laterals branching off like ribs. Beckner walked deeper into the tunnel, past rows of cots and headquarters officers and the low hum of generators. His chest tightened, and he knew he could not stay underground. He chose to sleep on the surface despite the bombs. Accepting his role as a reserve corpsman, he spread his blanket on the hard ground near the tunnel entrance, where the night air was open. The vibrations of distant explosions traveled through the earth beneath him, but he could see the stars, and that was enough. On December 29th, Beckner volunteered to deliver a sealed bag of medicines to Army Hospital No. 1 on Bataan. He rode across the channel by PT boat and then north by truck along the East Road. At the hospital, he found a Navy nurse named Liz who had worked at Canyacao. He asked about Tilly Finian. She told him the Navy nurses' fates were unclear. Some had been trapped in Manila, but others had managed to scatter to hospitals on Bataan before the roads closed. No one could confirm where Tilly was. Beckner returned to Corregidor with the news sitting cold in his chest. He had lost his squadron, his plane, and now his hope of finding Tilly. On the boat ride back, he met Bill Johnson again, a radio man he had seen on earlier crossings. Johnson mentioned that PT Squadron 3 was still active and might take on another corpsman. He offered to speak to Lieutenant Bulkley. Charles saw a way forward and began asking Johnson to put his name in for a transfer. On the morning of January 6th, Charles arrived at Sisseman Cove, a small fishing village on the eastern edge of Mariveles Bay. The cove was home to Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, and the place looked nothing like a proper Navy base. Nipa huts lined a single dirt street, and mechanical parts sat rusting under elevated floors. Bill Johnson, a radio man Charles had met on earlier boat rides, waved him over and introduced him to John Bellag, the squadron's senior corpsman. Bellag explained the situation plainly. The fuel barge had been sabotaged with paraffin, and every PT boat's engines risked stalling without warning. Charles formally reported to PT-34, where he met the acting captain, Ensign Baron Chandler. Jesse Clark, a seaman from Wyoming, climbed into the starboard machine gun turret and walked Charles through the twin-mounted 50 calibers. Charles recited the weapon's specifications and demonstrated he could clear a jam blindfolded. Clark nodded and declared him qualified. The crew was a mix of regular Navy men and late arrivals, but they shared one understanding. The boat was only as good as its guns, and those guns needed working ammunition, not the practice rounds that had doomed the PBYs at Olongapo. On the night of January 18th, PT-34 slipped into Binanga Bay inside Japanese-controlled Subic Bay. Lieutenant John Bulkley, the squadron commander, sat in his aluminum chair just behind the cockpit, directing the attack. The forward torpedo fired and struck a two-mast freighter at the waterline, erupting in a bright fireball. A second torpedo ejected only two-thirds of the way and stuck, its engine shrieking as it ran hot in the tube. The Japanese freighter's searchlight found them, and Charles, staring at the superstructure to aim, was blinded by the beam and could not fire effectively. Torpedoman First Class John Martino did not hesitate. He crawled out onto the deck, crouched under the plume of steam from the racing engine, and opened an access hatch on the torpedo's side. With the calm of a surgeon, he reached in and closed the valve on the airline. The engine stopped instantly, but the torpedo's nose propeller still dipped into the waves with every roll, and each rotation brought it closer to arming the warhead. Martino straddled the cylinder like a bucking bull, scooted to the tip, and stuffed toilet paper into the propeller to block it. The crew could not free the torpedo from its tube, so they lashed it down. Hours later, a large wave jarred it loose and it sank harmlessly into the sea. Lieutenant Bulkley hailed the craft in the darkness. Chandler gunned the engines and drove PT-34 in a tight circle, giving Charles and Clark alternating fields of fire. Charles poured short bursts into the barge, each burst slamming 50 to 60 rounds through the wooden hull and into the packed troops. After a second barge appeared and was also engaged, Charles concentrated on the stern, where the fuel tank was located. One tracer ignited the aviation gasoline, and the stern erupted in a sheet of orange fire. Both barges sank, and only a handful of Japanese soldiers survived to be taken prisoner. Ensign Chandler collapsed on the deck with a bullet in his foot, and Charles took charge of his care, applying pressure bandages and morphine, while the boat made for home. On the afternoon of January 25th, PT-34 rode at anchor in Sisseman Bay while the crew took a rare break. Someone spotted a group of women on the beach, and binoculars were passed from hand to hand. They were nurses from Army Hospital No. 2, bathing in the cove. Charles caught a flash of red hair as one of them turned to leave and his chest tightened. He knew that hair, it had to be Tilly. He started stripping off his boots and shirt to swim ashore, but Clark grabbed his arm and pointed to the dark shapes in the water, sharks patrolling the shallows. By the time Charles looked up, the red hair had vanished into the tree line. 3 weeks passed before Charles had a chance to act on that sighting. On February 13th, he was ordered to help transport 3 sick nurses from Hospital No. 2 to the Tunnel Hospital on Corregidor. He signed for the medical delivery and climbed onto the truck at cab cabin, scanning every face as the convoy rumbled south through the jungle. The hospital was a sprawling maze of cots under canvas tarps, filled with men suffering from malaria, dysentery, and gangrene. Charles moved through the wards asking for a Navy nurse named Tilly Finian, until a dark-eyed nurse named Trish pointed him toward the gas gangrene unit upriver. He found Tilly kneeling beside a patient in oversized coveralls, her red hair pinned up and a cloth mask hanging loose around her neck. She was gaunt, hollow-cheeked and exhausted, but she was alive. She stood and stared at him for a long moment before wrapping her arms around him in a silent embrace. She told him about the gangrene ward, the shortage of pain medication, and the nurses who had accepted marriage proposals from men who believed there was no future. Charles opened his medical pack and handed her 8 of his 9 syrettes of morphine. They exchanged promises. If one of them did not survive, the other would remember, would write, would never let the memory fade. Charles returned to PT-34 with Tilly's words ringing in his ears. He had found her alive on Bataan against every expectation, and she had asked him to promise something he could not guarantee. He carried that weight back to the cove, where the engines still coughed on paraffin-clogged fuel and the crew still lived from one patrol to the next. The squadron had sunk 2 barges and survived a close call with a hot torpedo, but the war was far from over. Charles checked his guns, cleaned his medical pack, and waited for the next mission, carrying the memory of her face and the pressure of a promise he intended to keep. Late February, the men of PT-34 at Sissamon Cove felt the atmosphere shift. For days, they worked under a new urgency. Extra fuel barrels rolled onto the deck, the boat repainted in dark green camouflage, and whispered rumors that the squadron was about to break out for China. Reporter Nathaniel Floyd appeared on the dock, fishing for details, and Charles knew that something big was being planned. Lieutenant John Bulkley kept the true objective sealed inside his head until the evening of March 11th. That night, Admiral Rockwell stepped aboard PT-34, followed by a group of Army generals carrying leather briefcases. The silence of the officers told the crew everything they needed to know. This was no ordinary patrol. The mission was not a dash for China. It was the evacuation of General Douglas MacArthur from Corregidor, a desperate run south through Japanese-held waters to an airstrip on Mindanao. Charles felt the weight of that knowledge as the Packard engines rumbled to life and PT-34 slipped out of the cove into the darkness. At sunset on March 11th, the 3 boats of MTB-3 navigated through the minefields under cover of Corregidor's artillery fire. PT-34 took the lead, her deck stacked with fuel barrels and her crew at battle stations. Charles scanned the black water from his starboard turret, the salt spray already stinging his eyes. In the early hours of March 12th, the engines stuttered and died. All 3 Packard motors lost fuel suction at the same moment, and the boat drifted dead in the water. Machinist's mate Velthunter rushed below, primed the fuel system, and coaxed the engines back to life one by one. But the other boats had vanished into the night. Lieutenant Robert Kelly had no charts, only a hand-drawn sketch of Tagawayan Island and a compass bearing. At dawn, his dead reckoning brought them to the exact cove. The anchorage was empty. PT-41 was not there. Kelly anchored the boat and ordered the crew to camouflage the deck with palm fronds. Hours passed. Around midday, 3 Japanese destroyers steamed past the mouth of the cove, close enough for the crew to see their masts above the tree line, but the camouflage boat went unnoticed. It was not until mid-afternoon that PT-41 finally appeared, rounding the island and cruising into the bay. On the morning of March 13th, the 2 boats rounded Macabalan Point and made landfall at Cagayan on Mindanao. The dock was empty, the garrison having mistaken the approaching engines for Japanese bombers. Within minutes, General William Sharp's sedan appeared, and Douglas MacArthur stepped onto solid ground. MacArthur called the crews to attention and personally awarded the Silver Star to every man in MTB-3. He shook Bulkley's hand and said, "You've taken me out of the jaws of death, and I won't forget it." Then he ordered the squadron to continue offensive operations against the Japanese in the waters north of Mindanao. Charles stood on the dock with the Silver Star pinned to his tattered shirt. The faces of those left behind still burned in his memory, Tilly in her coveralls at Hospital No. 2. The men of Patrol Wing 10 stranded on Bataan, the crew of PT-32 who never reached Mindanao. Their ultimate fates remained scattered by the war, lost in the chaos that followed. Charles carried their stories with him, uncertain whether he would ever see them again, bound by a promise to remember. If you have any stories or memories of the Philippine campaign, of the men who fought and died there, or of family members who served in the Pacific Theater, please share them in the comments below. We read every one, and if you found this documentary worthwhile, Please subscribe and give the video a like to support our work. Thank you for listening.